Hi there, my name is Bran Nicol. I'm speaking to you from the near past, but I'm speaking about the near future and about the present, which, as people at this conference know perhaps better than anyone else, are becoming increasingly blurred, increasingly the same thing. I'm speaking to you from the University of Surrey, and I'm imagining that you're in the University of Lancaster. But of course, these spatial categories have also begun to blur. There are immediate reasons for this. We know all too well the effects of the lockdown. But I think the temporary conditions that we find ourselves in now are also somehow representative of the alterations in how we conceive of space in the age of earthquakes, or the age of the extreme present. So we're all here together in a virtual Lancaster. Virtual everything may be, but I would like to offer my real genuine thanks to Andy Tate and his team for inviting me to speak, which I'm delighted to do, and for organising what looks to be a wonderful conference. And I'm really looking forward to meeting attendees, albeit virtually, in a few weeks' time. So my lecture has 4 parts. It's called Fiction in the Age of Smupidity, and it's about Douglas Coupland, of course, but I'm more interested in placing Coupland into a context. There are 4 parts to the lecture. Part 1, the age of Smupidity. I mentioned the age of earthquakes. The age of earthquakes is a phrase used by Douglas Coupland, Shimon Basar, and Hans Ulrich Obrist in their 2015 book of that name. It denotes how we have both changed the structure of the planet through our use of carbon, primarily to fuel our electronic life, and also through the internet specifically. The way that technology impacts on our lives has been a feature of Coupland's work pretty much since the outlet. Dan in Microserfs worries that so many people no longer have lives that you really have to wonder if some new mode of existence is being created, which is going to become so huge that it's no longer on the moral scale, simply the way people are. But the 1990s tech revolution, the focus of Microserfs, has been superseded by its next stage. This is what was once known as Web 2.0, a title which now itself seems somewhat anachronistic, inevitably. However, it refers to an internet so transformed by user-generated content, a more dynamic, interactive, multi-authored, and continually updating phenomenon, typified by microblogging social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter, that it became portable and has begun to rewire our brains, in Coupland's terms. And the consequent rewiring of humanity has been the topic overall of the more recent Coupland writings I'm going to be engaging with most in this talk. It'll draw mainly on works that he wrote mainly, but wrote in collaboration with others in terms of the age of earthquakes from the period 2013 to 2018. The works more specifically are Shopping in Jail, The Age of Earthquakes, Bit Rot, and Machines Will Make Better Choices Than Humans. Now, I've always enjoyed Coupland's writing, I think for 3 reasons. First, his ability to write entertaining narratives about real people, narratives that are witty and contemporary. Second, his ability and willingness to analyse and describe the aspects of the times that we live in through pithy, witty neologisms. He is the most contemporary, and I use that term in its original sense, contempo, with time, of novelists, a historian of the immediate present. Now, this is something he's been doing from the start, since Generation X and its memorable terms, historical underdosing, vaccinated time travel, clique maintenance, etc. And third, I think there's something I've always found that's deeply poignant about the narratives that Coupland writes. Narratives which are often about characters who have lost their story. Their lives stopped feeling like a linear event-based narrative, as Samuel Salemakers puts it in the afterword to Bit Rot. Now, these more recent works that I'm referring to continue Coupland's prescient documentation in novels like Generation X, Microserfs, and Generation A of a present world which we're only just beginning to be aware of. but he's able to interpret and encapsulate in phrases or scenarios. But these words meditate ways in which the second phase of the internet, the consequences of which are far more seismic, have changed us. Recurring refrains run through these works. This state of affairs that we are confronted with is not alienation, nor is technology somehow a separate force from humanity. No, the internet merely mirrors the way our brains work, and is an expression of humanness. The works meditate the process of how our identity, in the form of memories and the information that Todd knows about us, have become offloaded onto hard drives or onto the cloud. The more we reveal about ourselves on the internet, the more we empty ourselves of content. It's a process of de-selfing, to quote from the Age of Earthquakes, or willingly diluting one's sense of self and ego by plastering the internet with as much information as possible. One of the many effects described in these recent writings is smupidity. Smupidity is defined as the mental state wherein we acknowledge that we've never been smarter as individuals, and yet somehow we've never felt stupider. One possible explanation for smupidity is that people are generally far more aware than they ever were of all the information they don't know. The weight of this fact, the authors write, overshadows huge advances made in knowledge accumulation and pattern recognition skills honed by online searching. So smupid, as the neologism suggests, is a particular kind of stupidity, characterized by reflexive awareness of what we don't know, i.e. what we don't know about the vastness of information. Its counterpart, and there are often counterparts in Coupland's lexicons, is Stuart, when our smartness makes us realize we're stupid. Both smupidity and Stuart are conditions which involve a degree of self-reflexivity, a checking on one's own processes based on our knowledge of how the internet has changed us. The conviction that the internet has rewired us, and part of that rewiring is an extra dimension of self-reflexivity. Now, this may perhaps coincide with what sociologists refer to as reflexive modernity, a knee-jerk tendency to continually reflect on our processes, most obviously visible, I think, in the way that we're immediately invited to provide instant feedback of our experience of everything, from buying a product to going to the toilet in a shopping mall. Reflexive modernity is actually different from self-reflexivity, but this is a debate for another occasion. Really, my interest in this talk is in what the function of fiction is, and the novel in particular, in such a world. I hasten to add that this is not an original question. In 2007, in Andy Tate's excellent study of Douglas Coupland, he asks what is, I think, an implicitly rhetorical question. What place do conventional novels have in an era that has invested so heavily, literally and figuratively, in electronic media and the spectacular forms of film and television? Now, I think this is implicitly rhetorical because the answer is not that novels have no place, but that the novel is an evolving, elastic form, as Tate puts it, and will mutate to continue existing. Coupland himself, by 2007, was persevering with the novel as his principal mode of aesthetic experiment. But the what place does the novel have question becomes more prescient now, nearly 15 years later, precisely because of the advent of social media and the shift of our world into the extreme present. There's also arguably a shift in the balance of Coupland's work itself. Though novels have continued to appear, The Gum Thief in 2007, Generation A 2009, Worst Person Ever 2013, Coupland has increasingly turned to visual art, to work in other media, and the collection of short stories and essays which I've been concentrating on here. Is this a personal preference, or is it because the novel is somehow ill-equipped to deal with our current situation? That may remain a moot question. I want to move on now to part 2, the extreme present. Overall, Coupland's work in this period is preoccupied by a sense of time, and by the fact that the present and the future are beginning to coincide, Or more precisely, the fact that the future is no longer distant, but just a short time ahead, perhaps as little as 5 seconds. In the Coupland lexicon, this is futuriosity, the sensation of already living in the future. Coupland has characterized the first decades of the 21st century as pitching us into an aura-free universe in which all eras coexist at once, a state of possibly permanent atemporality given to us courtesy of the internet. Ours is a world, he contends, with no dominant era because of the advent of the internet, the smartphone, Wikipedia, Google, YouTube, Twitter, all of which have collapsed both temporal and geographical distance. The essay that these comments appear in, Convergences, begins with him noting that one of the remarkable features of the otherwise fully televised events of 9/11, or more precisely their aftermath, have continued to function as a gateway between one era and the next in Coupland's recent history of the extreme present, i.e. from the 20th to the 21st century. 9/11 itself is not a direct cause of the futurosity and smupidity which pertains in the 21st century, but it does usher in the accelerated era where we are inhabiting the future in the present. One of the terms in Coupland's ongoing glossary for the extreme present, which features in Machines Will Make Better Choices Than Humans, is 9-penicillin, or the theoretical pill one could take to make oneself feel as though 9/11 never happened and one was still living in the 20th century. The extreme present means that there's no future, or at least no future the way we used to imagine it, as something distant and different, and onto which we project our techno-fantasies. It's here, and it feels odd, Coupland has said. Now, one of the main reasons for this collapsing of present and future into one another is, as the short book Machines Will Make Better Choices Than Humans shows, because of technological advances in data gathering and sharing. It's the power of machines and markets, in other words. And I think it's notable that Coupland takes less of a position on this than prominent literary theorists and sociologists who have noticed something similar over the last couple of decades. As Michel van Dartel notes, Coupland doesn't seem to care much for utopian or dystopian views on technological developments, including those that currently seem to be radically revising our notion of the future. A number of absolute or perpetual presents have been proposed by theorists. Most famous is Frederick Jameson's argument that postmodernism was primarily a condition which, as part of the ceaseless late capitalist process of commodifying all areas of life, was experienced as the end of temporality. As he'd later put it, postmodernism effected a shrinking of contemporary bourgeois experience, such that we began to live in a perpetual present with a diminishing sense of temporal or indeed phenomenological continuities. A slightly different version of this has been provided by the British Marxist theorist Mark Fisher in his books Capital as Realism and Ghosts of My Life. He cites the phrase used by Jameson and Slavoj Žižek, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." Fisher contends that advanced capitalism cancels the future. Contemporary culture, he says, gives us an experience of broken time, of being unable today to focus on our own present, as though we'd become incapable of achieving aesthetic representations of our own current experience. An example he gives is Amy Winehouse's version of Valerie. And he argues convincingly, I think, that this recording is so accurate in producing an antiquated 1960s soul sound that it sounds as if the Zootons original from 2006 was a cover of this Winehouse version. And thirdly, in his essay Time Against Time, or the Hypermodern Society, the French sociologist Gilles Lipovetsky argues that postmodernism is characterized by the state of the absolute present. Central to the modernist project was the faith in the future. But modernity failed to realize the goals of the Enlightenment, and this recognition meant that both the past and the future were discredited, or at least the faith in the future as the time when suffering, etc., will be alleviated by the modernist project had collapsed. The result is that enthusiastic visions of historical progress, Lipovetsky's words, were replaced with a temporality dominated by precariousness and ephemerality, the primacy of the here and now, in alignment with consumerist norms centered on living in the present. Unlike Jameson, Lipovetsky is one who believes postmodernism is over. But suffice to say here that Lipovetsky's alternative to postmodernism, the pure future, looks a lot like a consequence of the absolute present. After postmodernism, he argues, the future has returned, only it's a future which is not narrativized, not bound up with post-religious narratives of progress nor happiness. Hypermodernity, as he calls it, is distinguished by the modernist logic of change, renewal, and supersession done to excess, to the extent that it represents the very consummation of modernity, an absolute modernity where the first stage was only limited modernity. We are now living with a pure future, he writes, one that needs to be constructed without any guarantees. We are beset by anxieties about the future, which are replacing the mystique of progress. And this means placing the emphasis not on ideology or politics, but on science and technology. These can protect us. I want to turn to part 3, fiction of the extreme present. Absolute present, perpetual present, the cancelled future, the pure future. These concepts are compatible with Coupland's extreme present. But there are some significant differences. Coupland is the only one to focus specifically on the effects of the internet in causing this situation. His analysis is especially valuable, I think, because it focuses on a psychological, perhaps even a phenomenological approach, i.e. it focuses on what it feels like to live in this world, how to behave, what the evidence of the internet rewiring activity has been. And I think the absence of this interest in other theorists is understandable, partly because they are writing before the advent of Web 2.0, and partly because they're also keen to assess the effect of the all-embracing mode of capitalism. Coupland also provides what I think is the best example of how fiction has changed as a result, in a way which doesn't simply reduce it to the kind of a reductive understanding of literature which should be avoided. The existence of the absolute present and the lack of faith in a distinct future is one which has clearly affected the contemporary novel. William Gibson recently acknowledged that around the turn of the 21st century, he stopped writing novels set in the far future and turned to writing novels of the recent past, because of his conviction that the present is already science fictional. Other novelists confine themselves to predicting only the very near future, as in Dave Eggers' The Circle, or to writing a dystopia which is not set in a distant though recognizable future in the classic form of Brave New World or The Handmaid's Tale, but in the parallel universe of the near past, as in Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. For Mark Fisher, the perpetual present leads to fiction which, like David Peace's Red Riding Quartet, is fixed in and fixated on the past. The 1970s in particular, and for Fisher this is because the 70s is the threshold between the social democratic world and the neoliberal one that we now inhabit. Jameson, in his 2013 book Antinomies of Realism, regards our era as subject to the same weaknesses of the postmodern era and finds in most fiction a similar enfeeblement of historical consciousness and a sense of the past. But Coupland's essay, Convergences, details his understanding of the extreme present and began life as a 2012 review of the British postmodern writer Harry Kunzru's novel, Gods Without Men. Coupland argues that during Kunzru's novel, might be representative of a new genre called translit. This is the kind of novel which contains a multiplicity of narratives, all depicting different worlds and timescales. As well as Gods Without Men, there is Kunzru's Memory Palace and Transmission. There's also David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas and Number 9 Dream. Now, the narrative, made up of different interlocking stories, goes back to Scheherazade and clearly has some roots in postmodernism, for example in novels such as Calvino's If on a Winter's Night, A Traveller, or in the dual time period novels popular in postmodernism, which Linda Hutcheon famously termed historiographic metafictions. But Translit is born of a distinctive temporality, or rather an atemporality of 21st century Western culture. It's a product of the world with no dominant era that Coupland writes about in that essay, and which the internet has collapsed temporal and geographical distance. Translit represents our new world of flattened time and space. The experience of reading Gods Without Men, Coupland suggests, resembles watching a TV show that's simultaneously happening on multiple channels, a story filmed in different eras using different technologies, but which taken together tell the same single story, echoing and reinfecting itself. The way the events in each novel intertwines in implausible ways is significant. It's as if it's born of a fear of random contingent events, but insists on the connectedness of the characters and events. Now, this might be seen as a kind of Jamesonian conclusion about the flattening of history and the absence of productive political historical depth. Yet, at the same time, Coupland notices something excessive about Translit's layering of stories and temporalities, something excessive but also extreme. Translit also favours expression in multiple genres. Translit prose, Coupland writes, while crossing genres within itself. And what this reference to genres crossing within itself seems to mean here is that rather than the dedicated parodic renovation of a particular genre, which is typical of the ironic spirit of postmodernism, Translit switches between genres at the level of discourse, evoking genres as and when it's appropriate or instinctive. So I come now to the final part 4, fiction from individuals to units. I want to concentrate here on Douglas Coupland's writing itself. It's notable that Coupland himself does not produce Translit. He has not obviously responded to the conditions of the extreme present by developing a new literary form. In fact, the attitude towards literature in his depiction of the conditions of the extreme present is rather dispassionate. Earlier, I mentioned how non-committal Coupland's approach to exploring the world of the extreme present is, in comparison to thinkers like Jameson and especially Fisher. The Baudrillardian term cool would perhaps be the best description. Now, in Baudrillard, the designation cool stands for something lifeless, static, no longer vital in the mind of the person doing the recollecting, and hot the opposite. One of the striking things about Coupland's recent work is that it seems to maintain as neutral a stance as possible about whether or not the rewiring of the human brain he is documenting is a bad thing. And in fact, these writings will not let us conclude that the internet is a bad thing, that it has divorced us from humanity. Because remember, the internet and its effects is our evolved humanity. These writings refuse to allow us to deny that things are as good as they've ever been, that we're more knowledgeable, more efficient than we've ever been. To be honest, Coupland says in the interview which concludes machines will make better choices than humans, right now is pretty close to as perfected a world as we're ever likely to get. He deliberately, dispassionately seems to side with the techie rather than the artist. Nor will this recent work allow us to conclude that our circumstances mean we are no longer social beings. In Notes on Relationships in the 21st Century, included in Bitrot, Coupland muses that I don't think people being on their devices all the time is an indicator of social isolation. It's the opposite. And this writing won't even quite let us conclude that surrendering our individuality to the homogenized human brain created by the internet is a bad thing. And the same dispassionate stance, the same cool approach applies to the novel in this recent work. Coupland challenges what is termed in the Age of Earthquakes romantic denial, the dislike of having the traditional notion of personality reduced to a set of brain and body functions. We have to acknowledge our humanness, even if we stripped all human behavior down to a table of contents of structural and chemical functions. The essay 9 Readers in Bitrot reflects further on the need for individualism. There, Coupland wonders if the need for individualism is actually a brain mutation spread lightly throughout a population. 9 Readers begins with the fact that everyone is now writing precisely the kind of narrative expression of the thing which used to be the property of the novel, in blogs, vlogs, or websites. In other words, an expression of individuality. No one reads these. Their value is as expression, as a symptom of the crisis of individuality. He concludes, the novel made us individuals. The internet made us units. And writes that before the 21st century, we lived with the notion of oneself as a noble citizen of the world, a lone soul whose life was a story written across a span of 7 decades or so. We now live instead with the ever-gnawing sensation that oneself is really just one more meat unit among 7 billion other meat units. The only slight giveaway in the preservation of coolness is the term ever-gnawing. We, he says, feel this sensation, and this of course means Coupland too. The life of an individual was once a story, but now we are units. The implication is that we no longer have a story, or no longer have an individual story. The novel then, as the prime expression of individualism, and as the means by which this illusion of individualism is sustained, has apparently had its day. In The Age of Earthquakes, the authors write, reading is an activity that fosters a strong sense of individualism, and it created the 20th century. Yet at the same time, one thing I feel is subtly but unequivocally conveyed in this work and in Coupland's recent essays, and performatively in the stories which alternate with them, is the enduring value of narrative. Or to turn this round, one undesirable feature of the accelerated times we're living in is what's referred to in The Age of Earthquakes as denarration, the condition characterized by our lives no longer feeling like stories. The ultimate sequencing dysfunction, the authors write, is the inability to look at one's life as a meaningful sequence or story. This doesn't quite mean that formal, i.e. literary, narrative itself is diminishing, only that our lives are denarrativized. Yet the novel is still the place for telling stories about oneself and about other people. And if our lives no longer feel like stories, fiction has the potential to provide a remedy. And this brings me finally to consider the distinctive features of Coupland's writing. Beside the emphasis on the function of narrative in the lives of humans, and how these narratives are lost in the contemporary era, and the emptiness at the heart of his characters, the most distinctive feature of Coupland's work has been the authorial paratexts which punctuate his narratives, the typographical inserts, the symbols, the slogans, the glossaries. This itself has always made his fiction glisten with the luster of the extreme present. Fiction that is engaging directly with the universe of consumerism, of marketing, of the relentless observation and commentary upon the lives of human beings as they live them, that distinguishes our neoliberal late capitalist age. There's also what Coupland does with language, the combining of words, such as connectopathy, connection plus pathology, etc. This is both literary and a mirror of the process of how technological advances change society and humanity. The language is an attempt to capture change, i.e. before change captures us. It's the power of literature to describe, capture, defamiliarize, and make us think and reflect. One way of considering the function of art is, as Samuel Sailmakers puts it in his afterword to Bitrot, is as a conceptual or formal grid that is laid over the world, and the world appears anew, filtered, altered. This dimension of Coupland's fiction has always seemed to me as a crystallized shorthand version of one of the tasks the novel has always accomplished, to present us with a portrayal of humanity at a particular point in time in a way which enables readers to empathize with other people, to be reflexive about their own humanity and their own positioning in time. Coupland's method is to transform this fundamentally realist impulse into something suited to our post-realist, post-postmodern age. In Coupland's recent works, the collections I've been concentrating on here, it's as if the paratextual balance of his earlier work has altered. The inserts, the lexicon, the paratextual experimentation have become more central and constitute the main text rather than a supplement. The stories, say the stories of overblown, phantasmatic, apocalyptic perception in bit rot, or the witty yet slightly eerie parables like Meet Todd, have become supplementary. The paratextual dimension of Coupland's writing and his stories have, to an extent, swapped places, with the stories now being offered as interludes or illustrative episodes to highlight the analytical descriptions and the guides to life in the extreme present. Perhaps this recent work has become, as the Bitrot exhibition catalogue termed it, a presentation of Coupland's mindscape. In other words, stories, essays, things he's observed, collected, meditated upon. Whatever, it makes his recent work not simply an evolution of his own form of narrative, but a performative presentation of the conditions of the extreme present.